911, what's your emergency?
He's under. Oh, God, he's under. The whale hit him. There's blood everywhere.
Sir, listen to me. Where exactly are you?
Pacifica Marine Park, main stadium pool. They're pulling him out now, but he's not breathing.
The pool was silent, except for the faint slap of water against acrylic. And in the center, they pulled him out. Ethan's body limp, his wetsuit shredded, a dark plume still bleeding into the surface. Moments earlier, hundreds of people had been cheering, but now the stands stood empty, the smell of salt and iron hanging heavy in the air. Lara knelt at the edge, her hand still reaching for where his fingers had been, her eyes locked on the ripples that slowly smoothed back to glass. Somewhere deep below, a shadow moved once and vanished. If moments like this stay with you long after they pass, stay close, share, and subscribe to hear more true stories where the ocean reveals its most unforgiving side. The February sun hung low over Monterey Bay, painting the Pacifica Marine Park in pale gold. The salt-heavy breeze moved slowly through the empty rows of the stadium, carrying with it the faint cry of gulls circling high above. Ethan Morales moved along the slick, black edge of the Orca pool, his wetsuit clinging to him like a second skin. At 38, he was a fixture here, 16 years of shows, training sessions, and the quiet, early mornings no audience ever saw. His steps were measured, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes tracked every ripple in the dark blue water below. Raze was there, as always. 12,000 pounds of muscle and intelligence gliding beneath the surface, the white saddle patch flashing in and out of the water's sheen. The Orca's movements were smooth, almost lazy, but there was a stillness to the way he watched Ethan. Not the eager, playful energy. The crowd loved something quieter, heavier. A young trainer, Sam, leaned on the rail a few feet away, clipboard tucked under one arm. "He's looking tense this morning," he said in a half-whisper, as though worried the animal could understand. Ethan glanced down at Raze, who cut a slow arc beneath them. "It's just the cold," he replied, his voice calm, almost dismissive. "He'll loosen up once we start moving." The water gave off that familiar metallic scent of salt and chlorine. Somewhere deep in the filtration system, a pump hummed steadily, the only mechanical sound in the otherwise hushed arena. Ethan knelt by the edge, letting one gloved hand drift close to the surface. Sunlight bounced off tiny ripples, casting shifting light over his forearm. Then, without warning, Raze rolled and sliced past with a sudden burst of speed. His dorsal fin broke the surface cleanly, cutting a long, perfect line before disappearing again. The force sent a small wave over the platform, splashing Ethan's knee. It wasn't aggressive, not exactly, but the precision, the suddenness of it made Ethan pause. A shiver ran down his spine, uninvited, as if his body recognized something his mind didn't want to name. The stadium gates clanged open in the distance, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls. Soon, the quiet would be replaced with cheering families and the pounding rhythm of show music. For now, the water lay dark and calm again, hiding whatever had passed beneath. Ethan straightened, brushing the damp from his leg, and forced a small smile toward Sam. "See, just stretching out," he said. But his gaze lingered on the place where the fin had vanished, the faint ring of ripples slowly fading into stillness. By noon, the stands were packed shoulder to shoulder, the late winter sun glinting off sunglasses and phones raised for photos. The smell of buttered popcorn mingled with the sharp tang of salt water. Music boomed from the overhead speakers, the bright, percussive beat bouncing off the concrete walls. Children leaned over the railing, pointing at the glittering surface of the pool, waiting for the show to begin. Ethan stood near the side gate in his wetsuit, towel draped loosely over one shoulder. Beside him, Lara flipped through a clipboard stacked with behavior logs. Her brow was tight, eyes darting to the water between notes. "Last month's report," she murmured, tapping a page with her pen. Raze ignored 3 separate commands and avoided the sliding gate area altogether. Twice. "That's not nothing." Ethan glanced at the page, then at her, his voice even. "He's been eating well, engaging with me. It's just a phase. Her frown deepened, but she let it drop. A shout carried over the crowd from the far platform, one of the maintenance techs holding up a small tablet. Gate 3's sensors acting up again. He called, "It's sticking." The lead on duty waved him off. After the show, he yelled back, smiling at the guests behind him as though nothing had happened. Ethan turned to the water. The show's star was making slow, deliberate laps around the pool, but closer to the concrete edge than usual. Each pass seemed to bring him nearer to Ethan's legs. The water bulged slightly where his body moved beneath, and each time Ethan shifted to face the audience, he could feel those dark eyes locked on him. The air was filled with the clapping of excited hands and the steady rhythm of the show music. But beneath it, there was another sound, a low, intermittent thud from somewhere under the surface, like a muted drumbeat against metal. Ethan brushed it off. Crew members moved to their positions. 2 minutes, someone shouted. The signal light above the main platform clicked on, casting a red sheen on the wet tiles. Ethan crouched to adjust one of the floating markers near the edge. The rope tugged strangely in his hand. Then a sudden bump from below made the buoy lurch sideways, sliding toward the center of the pool. The rope went slack, and a shadow glided under the surface, impossibly large, skimming the spot where his knees had been just seconds before. He straightened slowly, eyes on the widening rings in the water, the noise of the crowd fading into a dull roar in his ears. The gate timer buzzed, calling him to his mark, but he kept his gaze fixed on that patch of rippling blue where the shadow had vanished. The stadium lights brightened as the announcer's voice echoed across the arena, but to Ethan, the first sound that truly hit him was a deep, resounding thud of water from somewhere below. It wasn't the crisp splash that came with a rehearsed breach. It was heavier, sharper, and it didn't belong in the opening sequence. He forced a breath through his chest and dove cleanly into the pool. The cold closed around him, biting through the thin neoprene of his wetsuit and settling into his bones. Underwater. The world went still except for the slow movement of shadows. Then Raze appeared, emerging from the gloom with a smooth, deliberate glide. His massive body brushed the current against Ethan's arm as he passed. The first loop was wide, the kind of gentle arc the audience loved to see enough to draw gasps from the front rows as the Orca's dorsal fin cut the surface. Ethan swam in place, watching, waiting for the signal moment to cue their first trick. But instead of breaking off toward the platform, Raze curved back in for a second loop tighter this time. The white of his underside flashed close, so close, Ethan could make out faint scratches in the skin along his flank. Up above, the audience roared with applause, thinking it was all part of the choreography. The muffled cheers drifted into the water, blending with the rhythm of Ethan's own breathing through clenched teeth. He raised his hand underwater, giving the signal for the spin. Normally, Raze would mirror him, twisting gracefully in tandem. Instead, the Orca continued his loop, his flukes sending a hard pulse of water into Ethan's face. Ethan surfaced for air, sputtering slightly as the spray hit him. "Easy, buddy," he murmured under his breath, too low for the crowd to hear. From above, no one saw the subtle hitch in the Orca's movements the way his tail slapped the water once. A short, sharp motion, out of rhythm. But Ethan felt it. With each pass, Raze's circle narrowed, pulling Ethan further from the pool's edge, away from the handholds and shallow zones that could give him leverage if something went wrong. The stadium music boomed, masking the low churn of the water around him. He glanced toward the trainers on deck, but their eyes were on the crowd, smiling, waving. Raze's shadow slid beneath him again, larger now, more defined. Ethan's heart began to race not from exertion, but from a cold certainty settling into his gut. He was in the center of the pool, the deepest point, the place with no quick way out, and Raze was still circling, closing the gap. He drew in a slow breath, the air tasting faintly of chlorine and salt, and kept his gaze fixed on the moving shadow. If the Orca decided to come straight at him, there'd be no time to react. The water near the show platform was calmer here, the sunlight spreading in wide, wavering bands beneath the surface. Ethan treaded slowly, feeling the pull of the filtration current against his legs. The crowd's clapping rolled over him like a distant drumbeat, muffled by the water in his ears. He caught a glimpse of Lara on the far side of the pool, standing just behind the trainer's gate. Her eyes were fixed on him, her lips pressed tight. As he waited for Raze to reappear, an old memory rose unbidden 6 months back. In a cramped meeting room behind the stadium, Lara had been there too, flipping through behavior logs, her voice steady but urgent as she detailed how Raze had grabbed a junior trainer's leg during a free swim. 40 seconds under, she'd said. He wouldn't release until 3 of us got in. The young trainer had limped away, knee wrapped in ice. The official incident report had labeled it playful overexertion. Management never spoke of it again. Ethan blinked the memory away just as a shadow slid beneath him. Raze moved past without the playful clicks and whistles that usually accompanied their shows. His massive flank brushed the current against Ethan's torso, his pectoral fin angling slightly toward him before vanishing again into the blue. Lara stepped forward on the platform, her expression shifting one quick shake of her head, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She was warning him. The music swelled, the bass thumping in time with the stomps and claps of the crowd. The announcer's voice boomed, pulling the audience into the next segment. Ethan knew the choreography by heart. He was supposed to cue Raze for a synchronized breach. Hundreds of expectant eyes were on him. Backing out now would mean stopping the show cold. He took a slow breath, scanning the water. The surface remained unbroken for a heartbeat too long. Then Raze came up in a sudden, vertical surge, his head and upper body breaking through in a spray of foam, close enough that the cold mist slapped Ethan's face. For a split second, they hovered there together, man and whale, the noise of the crowd dimming under the weight of that stare. Raze's eyes, deep and black, locked on Ethan's. They didn't blink. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. The space between them was no more than the width of an arm. One push from that immense body, one sudden movement, and the balance would tip. He could feel the tension in the water, coiled and waiting. The crack of water shattered the rhythm of the show, a violent tail slap that sent a geyser of spray arching into the air. The blast stung Ethan's cheeks and drenched his hair, beads of cold rolling down the back of his neck inside the wetsuit. The audience gasped, then broke into excited applause, but Ethan's focus was fixed on the orca's eyes. There was no spark of playfulness now, only a flat, intent stare that felt like it pinned him in place. He forced his breathing steady, raising an arm to wave at the crowd as though everything was under control. The music blared on, the bass thudding through the platform into the water. Without looking toward the safety zones, Ethan began to swim toward the center of the pool. Out here, the water was deepest, the tiled bottom barely visible even in the bright midday sun. The walls felt farther away, the escape routes nothing more than faint shapes beyond the glare on the surface. The announcer's voice cut in over the music, hyping the crowd for the dual dive, one of the show's most trusted finales. Ethan lifted his hand underwater in the practice signal for the synchronized descent. Usually, Raze would dip his head, match Ethan's pace, and they would vanish together in a clean, mirrored glide. But Raze didn't tip forward. He sank without warning, sliding straight down into the dark column of water like a falling shadow. No graceful arc, no hint of performance, just a steady, deliberate dive toward the depths. Ethan hovered, scanning the shifting blue around him. The pool suddenly felt cavernous, the noise above muted to a dull roar. Seconds stretched. He turned in the water, his pulse thudding louder than the muffled music. Nothing. No white markings flashing in the gloom, no bubbles, just the slow sway of the surface far overhead. Somewhere below, the orca was moving. Ethan could feel it in the subtle push of current against his calves, in the faint pressure change that tightened his ears. Every instinct told him to move toward the wall, to reach for the ladder just 30 feet away. But the choreography demanded stillness, and hundreds of eyes were waiting for the perfect moment. A flash of white passed beneath him, too fast to follow. He spun, but the shape was already gone. The water tasted sharper now, metallic on his tongue. A tightness curled in his gut, a cold certainty he couldn't shake if Raze came up now. There would be no time, no chance to react. From the depths, a shadow surged upward with terrifying speed. In the next heartbeat, Raze's massive head and shoulders exploded out of the gloom, slamming into Ethan's chest with bone-rattling force. The impact drove him up and out of the water in a spray of foam before gravity pulled them both back down. Ethan's lungs seized, the cold punching into him as he plunged beneath the surface. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything except the roar of bubbles rushing past his ears. Then the muffled din of the crowd reached him, cheers at first, the kind of roar he'd heard hundreds of times before. But somewhere above, cutting through the music, came a sharp, unmistakable scream. Lara's voice, shrill and urgent, ripped the illusion apart. Ethan twisted in the water, trying to swim toward the nearest wall, but a sudden crushing pressure clamped down on his lower leg. Pain shot through his body like an electric current. He looked down to see Raze's jaws locked around him, the black and white giant holding him as easily as a toy. Kicking did nothing. The grip only tightened. Ethan fought against the pull, using his arms to drag himself toward the faint outline of the safety net ahead. He was close enough to make out the dark shape of a pole being lowered and someone on deck reaching for him. His fingertips brushed the nylon mesh when Raze rolled without warning, twisting his entire body and yanking Ethan away in a powerful arc. The water around him swirled violently, his vision flashing between streaks of light and darkness. A splash above, the faint thud of something hitting the surface. Someone had thrown a bait bucket. Silvery fish drifted past in a cloud, but Raze didn't break stride, not even a flick of his eye. Instead, the Orca pivoted, massive flukes driving them deeper. The sunlight faded quickly, the water turning from turquoise to a cold, oppressive blue. Ethan's ears popped with the pressure. He tried to scream, but only a trail of bubbles escaped. Down here, the pool felt endless. The bottom tiles were just a suggestion in the haze, too far to offer any anchor. The only solid thing in the world was the iron hold around his leg, dragging him further from the air above. He clawed at Raze's flank, his fingers sliding uselessly over slick, cold skin. Somewhere far above, the crowd's noise had shifted. The rhythmic cheering was gone. What reached Ethan now were scattered shouts, frantic orders echoing through the water, and the faint, hollow clang of something metal striking against the pool's walls. But here in the dark, those sounds felt impossibly far away. Ethan burst through the surface with a desperate gasp, the air cutting into his lungs like cold glass. His head tipped back, eyes fluttering half shut, each breath shallow and ragged. The left side of his wetsuit was torn open, and from the deep gash along his ribcage, a dark plume of blood spread outward, curling into the water like smoke. The copper tang of it filled his mouth with every inhale. On the deck, Lara was on her knees, leaning so far over the edge that her palms pressed against the slick tiles. Her voice cracked as she shouted his name, one arm stretching out with the long aluminum rescue pole. Beside her, two other trainers crouched low, gripping their own poles, tips trembling just above the water's surface. "Grab it. Grab it now," one yelled, their voice hoarse with panic. The stadium's speakers screeched to life, replacing music with the harsh wail of the emergency alarm. It ricocheted off the concrete, drowning out the confused roar of the crowd. Orderlies and ushers swarmed the aisles, urging people toward the exits. Children clung to their parents, some crying uncontrollably, others staring wide-eyed at the water. The smell of fear seemed to seep into the air, thick and electric. For a heartbeat, the water calmed. Raze floated just out of sight, and Ethan's limbs moved sluggishly toward the edge. His hand brushed the cold stainless steel rail. Lara's fingers twitched toward his, so close they almost touched. "Come on." "Ethan, you've got it," she pleaded, her voice breaking. But then the pool behind him shifted just a subtle change at first, a low vibration against his legs. In an instant, it became a violent swell, the current surging forward as if the water itself had decided to reclaim him. Raze exploded upward from the depths, not beneath him this time, but from the side, slamming his massive head into Ethan's ribs. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Before he could cry out, the world tilted, the surface vanished, and he was pulled under with a force that spun him in a dizzying spiral. The pressure crushed against his ears, and the light fractured into chaotic shards above him. On deck, Lara lunged with the pole, but the tip sliced only water. One of the trainers shouted to close the gate, but the controls wouldn't respond. All they could see now was the widening cloud of red, the once clear water turning into a murky veil. Somewhere beneath that, the shadow of Raze twisted and rolled, holding Ethan tight in the grip of his jaws. And then, they were gone, swallowed whole by the depths, the water closing over as if nothing had happened at all. When they finally brought Ethan to the surface, his body was limp, the weight of him dragging against the arms that lifted him onto the slick platform. Water poured from his wetsuit in steady streams, mixing with the darker stain seeping from the deep wound along his ribs. The dive team worked in silence except for the sharp commands of the lead medic. Lara knelt beside them, her hands hovering, desperate to help, but powerless to stop what was unfolding. They started compressions, immediately counting aloud, breathing for him, willing the water from his lungs. 10 minutes blurred into something shapeless. The only markers, the rhythmic thump of palms against his chest and the faint, high-pitched beeping from the portable monitor. Each pause to check for a pulse ended the same way, with a shake of the head and another round of compressions. When the medic finally called it, the sound seemed to echo in the stillness that followed. Lara's breath caught. Around them, the stadium stood eerily quiet now, emptied except for a few scattered staff who lingered in shock. Beyond the gates, the muted wail of sirens faded into the distance. By late afternoon, word had traveled faster than the cleanup crews could drain and scrub the pool. News vans lined the street outside Pacifica Marine Park, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. On the main gate, visitors had begun to leave flowers, candles, and photos of Ethan, most showing him grinning beside Raze in sunnier days. 2 weeks later, the story detonated again when an internal safety report leaked to the press. Pages detailed months of unresolved maintenance failures, jammed gates, nets that wouldn't deploy, and multiple staff warnings about Raze's escalating aggression. Buried among them were emails from Ethan himself, requests to suspend free swims, notes about unusual behavior, none of which had ever been acted on. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Protesters gathered outside marine parks across the country, holding signs calling for an end to Orca captivity. Hashtags trended, petitions gained millions of signatures. Pacifica Marine Park released carefully worded statements, but their promises of reform rang hollow against the mounting outrage. On the day of the memorial, the stadium was dark. Staff, former trainers, and members of the community stood in a loose circle around the empty main pool. The water lay flat and still, reflecting the gray Monterey sky. Lara stood apart from the crowd, her eyes fixed on the glassy surface. A gentle slap of water against the acrylic wall broke the silence, soft, rhythmic, almost like a breath. It was the same sound that used to signal the start of a peaceful morning, back when Ethan would lean over the edge and greet the massive shadow rising to meet him. Now, it was only a hollow reminder, carrying with it the image she could never unsee, the black, unblinking eyes of Raze in those final seconds. The late light stretched across the empty stands, catching on the thin film of water still clinging to the glass. Lara stood alone, one hand resting on the cool rail, feeling the faint vibration of the pumps beneath her palm. The air smelled of salt and metal, sharp and lingering. Somewhere in the deep, the filtration jets hissed, breaking the silence just enough to remind her what lay beneath. She watched the surface, so still it seemed to be holding its breath. No crowd, no music, just the quiet weight of something that could never be taken back. It was hard to tell if the water was calmer now, or simply waiting. Maybe that's the question we're all left with. Are we keeping them safe, or keeping them? If this story stays with you, share it, talk about it, and subscribe for more truths the ocean doesn't let us forget.